podcast you're about to hear is true. The names have not been changed to protect the innocent, the guilty, or anyone else. If you're interested in the same type of discussion related to organized crime that you hear in the traditional media, stop listening now. If you're interested in thinking differently or learning something, turn up the volume on your computer, smartphone, or mobile device. This is The Racket Report. Here's Frank Morano.
Welcome to The Racket Report, the podcast that seeks to expand your understanding of the world of organized crime. And most of the people that listen to this podcast, believe it or not, have not been involved with organized crime, thankfully, either as a participant in it, a victim of it, or someone involved in law enforcement in a position to investigate it. Most folks have an interest in organized crime that was cultivated at least in part by the movies. There are so many great gangster movies. You know the names. They encompass all sorts of different eras of mafiadom. But one of the things that I don't think there's been a really thorough and complete look at has been the influence of the mafia on movies itself, on Hollywood. Hollywood not only as a geographic location, but as a movie industry. That is, until now. There is a terrific new book that chronicles the rise and decline of the mob in Hollywood, spanning the decades. It is thoroughly researched. It is really fascinating to read, the adventures, the interesting characters. Some are too colorful to be believed, but they are all too real. I want to welcome crime historian and the author of 17 books, the latest of which is Tinseltown Gangsters, Jeffrey Sussman. Jeff, it's great to talk to you again.
It's wonderful to be on your show again, Frank. It's a terrific program.
Thank you very much. So, Jeff, for people that have not heard our previous conversation, remind people you're clearly a very educated individual, somebody that could write about anything, and indeed, you've written about a number of different subjects. Why choose to spend any of your substantial talents researching, investigating, and chronicling the mob? A lot of people might view that as something that's sort of lowbrow and not worthy of your scholarship. Why have you chosen to write now multiple books about the mob?
Well, there were three incidents in my life which aroused my curiosity and my fascination about the mob. The first thing happened when I was bar mitzvahed. My father introduced me to an uncle of his by marriage whom I never knew about and never saw again. And he handed me an envelope of money, which was substantial, and congratulated me and shook my hand, and that was it. And I later asked my father, who was that, and why did he give me this money? And my father said that his name was Irving Kay. He was a bootlegger during Prohibition, and in 1935 he had been indicted but not tried for the murder of a gangster named Dutch Schultz. And I found that fascinating. And, you know, I looked up who Dutch Schultz was and what that was all about and so forth. And then when I was in my early teen years, I used to work for my father on Saturday mornings. My father owned two garment factories, one in Queens, one in Brooklyn. And he was open for half a day on Saturday mornings. And I would work for him from 9 a.m. till 1 p.m. And my work was fairly menial. It was sweeping up the floor, picking up scraps of garments that were then sent to a recycling company. But I would also occasionally be charged with bringing up bolts of cloth from the basement to a cutter's table where the cloth was laid out and dress patterns were cut out. And one day I was coming up the stairs from the basement with a bolt of cloth on my shoulder, and I heard my father and another man yelling at each other. And when I got to the top of the stairs, I saw my father. His fists were clenched, and as a young man, my father had been an amateur boxer, and he looked as if he was about to hit this guy. And he points a finger at this guy, and he says, "Get the effing out of here." And the guy makes a symbol with his hand, like a gun, with his forefinger and his thumb. Wow. And he says, "We're going to get you, you son of a bitch," and leaves. Well, driving home that afternoon, I asked my father what that was about. And he said that was a gangster named Johnny Dio who wanted to unionize my father's workers. And they rejected unionization because my father was a pretty good boss and he paid them fairly well. In addition to which was very unusual at that time, he provided them with 90 days of health insurance.
Oh.
And so they realized they would get a lot less if they joined this union. And so a few weeks later, my father and my mother took me out to celebrate my graduation from the 8th grade. And by the time we got home, our home had been broken into, and the kitchen had been wrecked. The refrigerator was overturned. Food was spilled and splashed all over the place. Dishes were broken. Glasses were broken. It was a mess. I didn't learn until a long time afterwards that was a message from the mob saying, this is just the beginning. You better cooperate with us or things are going to get a lot worse. Now, my mother had two cousins who, during the Depression, operated an Italian grocery store in Corona, Queens. And they would take turns going to law school every other semester. One would go to law school one semester, and the other one would operate the store, and so on until they completed law school. And they got to know a number of people in the mob during that period of time. And in 1956, I think it was, one of the brothers, his name was Joe Page, was arrested for torching a warehouse in the Bronx. And his photograph was on the front page of a tabloid newspaper that doesn't exist anymore called the Daily Mirror. And my father paid his bail. Joe was not convicted, but he did lose his law license. And my father went to him and told him what was happening with Johnny Dio. And he said, you know, he knows some of these people. Let me see what I can do for you. And he made a deal where my father wouldn't have to use their union, but he would have to hire their trucking company. And my father died 2 years later, and his partner in business, in the garment business, was not a strong man like my father. And the trucking company kept increasing their rates until they became really onerous. And the surviving partner started giving them pieces of the business. And as they got more and more control of the business, they started buying garments, raw materials for dresses and bathrobes and other kinds of garments, and not paying for them. So their credit was cut off. And eventually they took over the business, and when they could no longer get credit, they burnt the factory down for the insurance money.
Wow.
My father was dead by that point. My father had died 2 years later after the incident with Johnny Dio. He died of cancer. And then in 1981, I was divorced from my first wife, and I was very depressed about it. And I went to... a friend recommended a therapist for me to see, and I went to see him for a couple of years, and he helped me out quite a bit, and we became friends afterwards. And he was a fascinating man. His father controlled all the bookmaking in New York for Frank Costello, and Frank Costello was this therapist's godfather when he was growing up.
Wow.
And he told me some wonderful stories from his childhood. And also the fact that he had patients who were the sons of mobsters who were very conflicted about whether they wanted to go into the mob or not, or to have a legitimate life. That was his experience. And he chose a legitimate career for himself. But he told me a couple of incidents, such as his father and Frank Costello picked him up, I guess it was late spring or early summer, whatever, and they took him up to the races up in Saratoga, New York, and they gave him $100 to bet on the races, and he lost the $100. And when he graduated from high school, Frank Costello, who owned the Copacabana, he asked Frank if he could get him into the Copa with his date from the senior prom, and Frank arranged that. and they sat at a table right in front of the stage, and Frank Sinatra was the performer that night. And when it came time for them to get a check, they were told, it's on the house, that there's nothing you have to pay. So those three incidents kind of sparked my interest in the mob. And I also had friends, two retired New York City detectives who worked on organized crime strike forces, and also a friend of mine who was an attorney who's head of the Rackets Bureau in the Bronx DA's office. So I had all of this information, and I found it fascinating, and I decided to investigate and write about it.
That is interesting. You've done an incredible job in this book, which is called Tinseltown Gangsters, The Rise and Decline of the Mob in Hollywood. Now, before we can look at the mob's influence in Hollywood, let's talk about Hollywood itself, right? Because I think it'll be helpful for folks to have some context about how Hollywood came to be the movie-making mecca. Why did Hollywood become so associated with movie making? Why wasn't it, Edison, New Jersey, or Juneau, Alaska? Why Hollywood? How did Hollywood begin?
Well, it actually all started here in New York. This is where the major studios were. But the advantage of being out in Los Angeles is that you had nice weather year-round, which you didn't have in New York, and they were able to and also the laws were less restrictive out in Los Angeles at that time, and they all left New York and moved out to Los Angeles. The five major movie studios, which all started here in New York, wound up in Los Angeles during the silent film days.
The beginning of the mob's involvement in Hollywood, I love the phrase you use in your introduction where you talk about the mob's zest for money and compare it to a shark's thirst for blood. And it seems a very apropos metaphor. When and why, if the why wasn't obvious enough given the financial incentive, but when and why did the mob first become involved in Hollywood?
Well, initially Al Capone was kind of interested, but really didn't follow up on it. But Joseph Kennedy, Sr., had an opportunity to buy a small company called FOB, which was an importer and an exporter. And he bought the company. He borrowed some money from his father-in-law, and he borrowed money from the owner of Filene's department store in Boston, but it wasn't enough. And he had been dealing with mobsters in bootlegging, and he was able to borrow the balance of the money from the Chicago outfit. And he paid all the money back, but the outfit then realized after Kennedy's experience that there was gold in them, their hills. And they followed shortly thereafter. But Kennedy did some terrible things when he was there. He turned FOB into a very successful little company. They produced a movie a week for $30,000. It was usually a Western, a silent movie. And he became known in Hollywood as a good man with money. And he began having an affair with Gloria Swanson, who was the biggest film star of
Joe Kennedy did.
Joe Kennedy. Mm-hmm. And he showered her with very lavish gifts, diamond necklaces and bracelets and fur coats and cars and so forth. And after a few years, Gloria Swanson's accountant realized that Kennedy wasn't paying for these gifts. She was. All the money was coming out of her accounts to pay for this. And so that ended the relationship with Kennedy and Gloria Swanson. But then he did something that was really evil. He wanted to buy a chain of movie theaters called the Pantages Movie Theaters, which had been started by and owned by a Greek immigrant named Alex Pantages. And Kennedy offered him a lot of money, and Pantages turned him down, and Kennedy offered him again, and again Pantages turned him down, and this went on several times. And finally, Kennedy decided to do something very devious in order to get the theaters. He knew a woman named Eunice Pringle, who was an aspiring actress and a prostitute, and her boyfriend, who was an aspiring screenwriter and a pimp. And they had come to him previously looking for work. And he said to them, I'll give you work, but you have to do me a favor. And the favor was that Eunice had to accuse Alex Pantages of rape. And what she did is she hid in the closet off of his office, off of Pantages' office. And when he came into the office, she leapt out of the closet, tore the top of her gown, and shouted rape and started screaming. The upshot was that Pantages was arrested. He was tried and convicted and sentenced to 50 years in prison. Murderers don't get such long prison terms. And Kennedy bought the theaters for a fraction of what he originally offered Pantages. Pantages hired a criminal defense attorney named Jerry Geisler, who had been Bugsy Siegel's lawyer in Los Angeles. And Geisler was able to show the Court of Appeals that this guy had been framed and that it was a conspiracy. And so Pantages was let out of prison after 3 years. And Geisler went to Eunice Pringle saying that he needed to get a deposition from her about what Kennedy got her to do. And the day before she was to give the deposition, she was poisoned and killed.
Wow.
And no one was ever tried or convicted or arrested for that. And it was shortly after that Kennedy left Los Angeles and moved to Florida temporarily.
So, it's interesting. So my question was, when and why did the mob become involved in Hollywood? And I think when most people expect to hear names of mobsters, they expect to hear names like Gambino, Bonanno, Lucchese, Gotti, right. Costello, so on and so forth. And I think most people know of Joe Kennedy's affiliation with bootlegging during Prohibition, but they don't necessarily think of him as part of the mafia itself. What you're actually saying is that the beginning, the genesis of mob involvement in Hollywood began with Joe Kennedy himself.
Well, yeah, I mean, he preceded Bugsy Siegel, who came out there at the behest of the New York Gangsters and the Chicago outfit. And he was basically there to run a racing wire for them that all the bookies in the Southwest had to subscribe to. But while he was out there, he realized there was a lot of money that could be made in extorting the movie studios, and he got control of the Extras Union. And what he said, in effect, to the studios was, you better pay me $100,000 here or $100,000 there, or the extras are all going to go on strike, and that'll cause your productions to cease, and you're going to lose millions of dollars. So, when the outfit and the New York mobsters saw how much money Siegel was able to make from extorting the studios, in addition to controlling the racing wire, they realized that Hollywood was really ripe for extortion if they could get control of numerous different unions to which Hollywood workers were members of.
Let me ask you about a couple of other names that come up in the book, and we're not going to get to all of them, so people are just going to have to buy the book to see the full, versatile characters that were involved in the early days of Hollywood at this time. George Raft, who apparently you described Jimmy Cagney as saying was the toughest guy in Hollywood and maybe the toughest guy that he'd ever met. Who was George Raft?
George Raft, whose original name was Ranft, R-A-N-F-T, he grew up in Hell's Kitchen on the west side of Manhattan. He was a protege of a famous gangster named Oni the Killer Madden. And Oni and Bugsy Siegel had cooperated together before Bugsy moved out to Los Angeles. And George got to know them. But as Oni's protege, he used to participate with Oni in little crimes and loved going up to the top of a tenement building on the west side and dropping bricks on the heads of policemen. And he eventually became a dancer and a gigolo, And his dancing led him to having a career in the movies. And he cemented his friendship with Bugsy Siegel out in Los Angeles. And they were like brothers. They were so close together. And at one time, when the mob was trying to take over the Screen Actors Guild, and James Cagney was president of it, Cagney wouldn't go along with the mob, and so the mob issued a contract on Cagney's life. And when Cagney found out about it, he spoke to George Raft, who was able to get that contract rescinded. And for the rest of Cagney's life, he was always grateful to George Raft for that. And that's why he said that George Raft was probably the toughest guy in Hollywood. While there were all these men who portrayed gangsters in movies, George Raft was the real thing. And he associated with these people, and they were his friends.
One of the people that you've mentioned already a couple of times, and the folks may know the name because of his role not only in East Coast gangsterism, but in the foundation of Las Vegas and gambling in Las Vegas, is Bugsy Siegel. Who was Bugsy Siegel? What was his role in Hollywood?
He was basically an extortionist who loved hobnobbing with A-list movie stars and directors and producers. They became his friends. But he also he would throw these very lavish parties and invite them, and then he would borrow money from them. And because he had such a fearsome reputation, no one resisted lending him money. And of course, being a gangster, he never intended to pay any of the money back. And he bragged to Meyer Lansky that he had borrowed more than $400,000 from these people at his parties, and he would never pay it back. He was kind of proud of himself. But his parties, if he sent you an invitation to his party, you better not resist. He would take it personally if you resisted. And Jimmy Stewart refused to go to one of his parties and tried to dissuade his friends from going. And Bugsy Siegel confronted him, and Jimmy Stewart said to Bugsy, "Take your best shot at me." And George Raft was there, and he said to Jimmy Stewart, "If he takes his best shot at you, Jimmy, it'll be the last shot you ever hear." So I don't think you should do it.
All right. Somebody that might not be as well known to mob history or Hollywood history as Bugsy Siegel, but perhaps even more of an indelible mark left by this name is Mickey Cohen. Who was Mickey Cohen, and what was his role in Hollywood at the time?
Well, Mickey Cohen became an enforcer for Bugsy Siegel, but he started out as a gangster almost. When he was 9 years old, he had a little gang, and he held up the largest movie theater on Sunset Boulevard. He had a baseball bat, and he threatened the woman who was the ticket taker, and he said, "If you don't turn over all your receipts to me, all the money that you collected, I'm going to bash your skull in." And even though he was only 9 years old, Wow. He was so intimidating that you turned over all the money to him. As he got a little older, he tried boxing. He had, I think, 10 professional bouts. He won half and lost half. And then he moved back to Chicago, where he became a professional thief. But he brought a lot of heat on the outfit in Chicago, and they wanted him out of town. So they told him to go back to Los Angeles, which he did, and he went to work for Bugsy Siegel. And he was very devoted to Bugsy. And he continued the extortion rackets after Bugsy Siegel was assassinated, but he also started something called Hollywood Nightlife, which was a scandal sheet. And his partner in that was a man named Hank Santacola, who was Frank Sinatra's manager.
What year are we talking about here? Just give folks an idea of the time frame.
This was in the late 1940s, early 1950s. Mm-hmm. And they would go to actors and actresses who were having adulterous affairs, or maybe some were gay and some were lesbians, but the public didn't know about these things. And they would go to them and they would say, "You have to take out a full-page ad in Hollywood Nightlife, and you have to give us a large sum of money, or we're going to print this information about you." So that they extorted Robert Mitchum, they extorted Joan Crawford, who had appeared in a couple of porno movies before she became a famous actress. They even extorted Frank Sinatra, even though his manager was the co-publisher of the publication, wow. Because Sinatra was having an affair with Ava Gardner, and he didn't want the public or his family to know because he was still married to Nancy Sinatra. And Mickey Cohn was also a publicity hound. He, during the 1950s, he used to appear on a lot of talk shows on television, and he would come with a date who was either a stripper or a porno actress. And Mickey was a short man. He was only 5'5", and he would bring with him a very tall, sexy-looking blonde woman who was about 5'9" or 5'10". So they made a curious-looking couple. But he loved talking and being out in front of the media. He absolutely adored it.
But folks should be under the no misimpression. He was absolutely a gangster's gangster.
Oh, absolutely. And I think it was the early 1960s or late 1950s. He was interviewed on television by Mike Wallace, and Mike Wallace said, "How many people have you killed?" And I think Mickey said 11. But he said, you should know that I didn't kill anybody who didn't deserve to be killed. I wouldn't kill an innocent person.
All right. In terms of, a lot of people are familiar with the concept of a fixer, whether it's in gangster terms or in Hollywood terms. Certainly TV programs like Ray Donovan have made the idea of a fixer popularly known. One of the original fixers that apparently had quite a few dealings with the mob, you write about extensively in this book, that's Sidney Korshak. Who was Sidney Korshak?
Sidney Korshak was the outfit's lawyer in Los Angeles, and they never wanted anyone to know, and he didn't want anyone to know that he actually represented the mob. And he not only represented the mob, but he represented a number of Fortune 1000 and Fortune 500 companies. For a brief time, I believe he represented the Los Angeles Dodgers. He represented a large racetrack. He represented all the movie studios in Hollywood. And with a single phone call, he could make anything happen. So, for example, in 1968, Warren Beatty wanted to attend the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and he tried to get a room at the East Hotel, and it was booked. So he went into the payphone in the lobby, and he called Sidney Korshak and asked him if he could help get him a room. And Korshak said, "Hang on, I'll get back on the line in 5 minutes." And he did. He got back on the line in 5 minutes, and he said, "You have your choice of any of 3 suites in the hotel. You can have one, or you could have all of them, whatever you want."
Wow!
And he could get anyone's kid that he represented into an Ivy League college, and not only get them admitted to an Ivy League college, but he could get them a full scholarship as well. The FBI called him the most powerful lawyer in America.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like that was an exaggeration.
No, not at all.
In the slightest. Hey, just to go back to Bugsy Siegel for a second, the motion picture, I'm reminded because you mentioned Warren Beatty, the motion picture Bugsy, where Warren Beatty plays Bugsy Siegel, has him being killed by his mob cohorts because of what was going on in Las Vegas, accusations of skimming, cost overruns, delays. What does your research suggest about the actual reason that Bugsy Siegel was killed?
He was skimming a lot of money from the building of the Flamingo Hotel.
So you buy that version that's depicted in Bugsy, that he was killed by the mob in retribution for what he was doing.
Yeah, and he refused to pay back the money. He thought, look, I've known these guys since I was a teenager. They know I'm a thief. Leave me alone. You're going to make a lot of money from this. What the movie had wrong, though, is that Virginia Hill was in Europe at the time, and she suspected that Bugsy might be killed, and she didn't want to be around him at all during that time. Also, the two of them, Bugsy had divorced his wife, and he secretly married Virginia Hill in Mexico City, which the movie didn't depict.
One of the things that you get into a little bit is the mob's role in pornography. Certainly films like Deep Throat have been talked about as big money makers for the mob, both through direct sales and through overt extortion. What did the mob do with respect to the pornographic film industry?
They invested in terms of Deep Throat. They invested a very small amount of money, and they made over $50 million. It was the most profitable movie, legitimate movie or illegitimate movie, the year that it came out. It was extraordinary, and it opened a whole field of making pornographic movies during what was called the golden age of pornography, which was in the early 70s. And they owned theaters and buildings on 42nd Street, West 42nd Street in New York. They owned a lot of they financed a ton of these movies and made a fortune from them. And they paid the people who acted in them very little money. Linda Lovelace, who starred in Deep Throat, got paid $1,200, as did Harry Reams, who co-starred with her in that movie.
Wow. So at its height, how would you characterize the influence of the mob in Hollywood, not just in the pornographic film business, but in terms of the film business in general?
They played a very important role in financing movies. In particular, Columbia Pictures during the 1940s and 50s, when Harry Cohn was president, he took large investments from different mobsters. So, for example, Longies Willman, who was known as the Al Capone of New Jersey, invested $500,000 in Columbia Pictures, and his girlfriend at the time was Jean Harlow. And part of the deal was that she had to star in a couple of movies if Harry Cohn wanted the money. And that's also how Frank Sinatra got his part in the
From Here to Eternity.
From Here to Eternity. It wasn't anything like in The Godfather. Frank Sinatra's godfather was a partner of Willie Moretti. Frank Sinatra's godfather was a partner of Longies Willman in New Jersey, and Willie Moretti was Frank Sinatra's godfather. And Willie Moretti was the cousin of Frank Costello. And when Frank wanted to part in From Here to Eternity, he asked Willie Moretti to help him, and Willie Moretti called Frank Costello, who had invested a lot of money in Columbia Pictures. And all he did basically was call Harry Cohn and ask him to do him this favor. Initially, Harry Cohn wanted Eli Wallach to play that part that Sinatra got, but Wallach was in a Broadway play and didn't want to give it up, so by default, it went to Sinatra. But it was a very simple return of a favor transaction.
So it does sound like there is some element of truth to what's depicted in The Godfather. There was at least some mob interceding in terms of getting Sinatra that role.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if you ever read Sinatra's FBI file, or part of it, it's 1,400 pages. It's the longest FBI file on any celebrity, and it depicts his involvement with the mob, and he was very deeply involved with them. In effect, they owned him. They began his career, and the mob doesn't do things as a favor because they're being generous to someone. They want something in return, and they got Frank Sinatra started on his career, and basically they owned him for the rest of his career.
One of the things that I think people tend to associate with the mob, particularly at the height of its power, is murders. They associate body counts and gangland wars. That's one thing that we haven't mentioned thus far. In the heyday of the mob in Hollywood, were there a lot of gangland murders? And what's a lot? How many murders are we talking about over what period of time?
There weren't a lot of murders. There were gangsters who killed each other. After Bugsy Siegel died, Mickey Cohn took over his rackets, but he was in conflict with a guy named Jack Dragna, who had the Dragna Mafia family in Los Angeles, and they were killing each other's people, but they weren't killing, people who worked in Hollywood. There were a couple of people who were killed, and Hollywood studios would if they wanted somebody killed, they would arrange it. So, for example, Harry Cohn, when he was president of Columbia Pictures, he would mold a lot of these blonde movie stars into becoming big stars. And in the 1950s, for him, that was Kim Novak. And Kim Novak was having an affair at the time with Sammy Davis Jr. And Harry Cohn was worried that if this became public, that his movies would be boycotted in the South because of that interracial relationship. So he demanded that Sammy break up with Kim Novak, and they refused to break up. So he sent Mickey Cohn to them and said to them that, Harry has put out a contract on your life, Sammy. You better break up with Kim. And Sammy didn't believe it. And then two gangsters went out to see Sammy, and they came into his dressing room, and they said to him, well, one of them said to him, look, you're a one-eyed black Jew, and if you don't break up with Kim Novak, you're going to be a blind black Jew.
Oh, boy, geez.
And not only that, you have 48 hours to break up and marry a black woman. And he did. He found a lounge singer in Las Vegas. He paid her $25,000 to marry him, gave her another $10,000 for her wardrobe. They stayed married for a few months and then divorced.
Wow. So even someone as big a celebrity as Sammy Davis Jr. was that easily intimidated by the mob?
Yeah. And on another occasion, when Robert Evans, the producer, when his relationship with Ally McGraw broke up and she married Steve McQueen, she and Steve McQueen wanted to adopt the son that she had with Robert Evans and change his surname from Evans to McQueen. And Robert Evans was very upset about this, and he spoke to Sidney Korshak about it, and Sidney Korshak called Steve McQueen and said, I'd like to speak with you, come to my office. McQueen really didn't know that much about Korshak at the time, but when he found out that he could have him killed, McQueen became terrified, and he went to Korshak's office, and he was almost crying. I mean, here's this screen tough guy who's quaking in his boots saying to Korshak, look, we're not going to adopt the boy. We don't want to change his surname, but please don't have me killed.
All right. Now, the log line of your book is the rise and decline of the mob in Hollywood. It sounds like this was a great partnership. Sounds like there were a lot of great movies being made. Sounds like the mob was making money and the body count, at least among civilians, was minimal. How did it all come to an end?
Well, I don't know if it ever came to an end. I think that movies are still, so profitable. They can make so much money that all you need is sort of a mob-run hedge fund or a mob-run finance company to be a front and to invest in a movie. Somebody said the most creative people in Hollywood are the accountants, because if a movie makes $50 million, it manages to lose money. And yet the people who produced it, are making millions. But on paper, the movie loses money, and that's a perfect vehicle for the mob. I mean, because there are no taxes that have to be paid, and the mob has always loved things where they could skim money and not pay taxes. And the accountants in Hollywood that show that movies are never profitable, even though they make hundreds of millions of dollars, is a perfect vehicle for a mob-run finance company.
So you believe that there's still a mob influence in Hollywood, then?
Yes.
Wow, and very interesting. Hey, what are you hoping people get out of this? Why did you write this? What are you most hoping people learn from this?
I think that a lot of people, they have a kind of romantic view of the mob basically on because of the movies that they see, but they don't understand, I think, how the mob operates at a very high level. The Godfather is a wonderful movie, but as Mario Puzo said, it's a fairy tale for adults. Mm-hmm. It's not realistic. And you take a movie like Goodfellas, which just deals with a bunch of kind of street hoodlums They're not higher ups. The only mob movie that comes close to doing that is Casino, where you see high level mobsters. And that was part of what I wanted to show. And the other thing is that I wanted to demonstrate how the mob has its fingers in so many different kinds of industries that people don't even think about it.
Yeah, no, I think you definitely succeeded in that. There are going to be those, obviously, that say this is your attempt to make money by the public's fascination in the mob, and that by telling stories about criminals, you're not doing anything to de-glamorize the mob. What do you say to that criticism, Jeff?
Well, I think I'm not glamorizing them at all, because I'm showing them at their worst kind of behavior. There are a number of people in this book, Willie Biaf, Roy Radin, others, who were kind of despicable characters, and they exerted enormous control over various aspects of the movie industry. And I'm certainly not trying to romanticize them. And unless somebody makes a movie out of my book, I'm not going to make very much money from it.
Hey, speaking of movies, there was a film a few years ago that dealt with the mob in Hollywood and in L.A. more broadly. It was called Gangster Squad. I didn't end up seeing it, but I'm curious, based on your experience, has there ever been a really good movie depicting the characters in Hollywood that you're talking about? Bugsy Siegel, Mickey Cohen, Sidney Korshak, Joe Kennedy Sr. Has there ever been one made? And if so, what would you recommend?
No, I can't think of one about that. But certainly someone should use my book to make a movie.
There you go.
Sure.
You're not going to get an argument from me on that. Jeff, congratulations on the new book. It's terrific. I hope people check it out.
Thank you very much, Frank. It's a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you. If you want to give me your feedback on any portion of our discussion, you can email me. My email is frank.morano@wabcradio.com. That's frank.morano@wabcradio.com. If someone sent you this podcast, please be so good as to subscribe. You can just go to wabcradio.com and search The Racket Report, or you can search The Racket Report on any podcast app. Hit the subscribe button, and if you leave a nice review and a 5-star rating, it really helps spread the visibility of the podcast. If you go to wabcradiostore.com, then you will be treated to a wide array of brand new Racket Report merchandise. I just bought a t-shirt myself, and you can buy something interesting as well. All right. I appreciate the conversation. If you want to check out Jeff Sussman's book, it's available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. It's called Tinseltown Gangsters. Until the next time we meet in cyberspace, I'll see you on the radio.